In 1923, a nation was born out of the ashes of an empire, and with it came a question that would haunt Turkey for the next 100 years. How does a Muslim-majority society decide what happens in its bedrooms? When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk declared the Republic of Turkey, he didn't just draw new borders. He set off a slow-motion collision between secular ambition and religious tradition, between European ideals and Anatolian custom, a collision that is still playing out today in courtrooms and parliament and on the streets of Istanbul. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a country that once banned the fez ended up debating whether to send LGBT people to prison in 2025, and why the answer to how modern is Turkey has never had a single, simple answer. Let's start at the beginning. The late Ottoman Empire was not the sexual free-for-all that Orientalist paintings imagined, nor was it a rigid theocracy. It was a patchwork. Elite households practiced polygamy under Islamic law, arranged marriages were the norm, and a woman's honor was treated as a matter of family property, something to be protected, negotiated, and occasionally weaponized. But same-sex relationships, while never legally sanctioned, existed in a strange gray zone. Ottoman poetry is full of romantic verses addressed to young men. Court culture had long tolerated certain forms of male companionship, and homosexuality, while frowned upon, was never criminalized under Ottoman law the way it was in much of contemporary Europe. That detail matters, because when the Republic replaced Ottoman religious law with a secular legal code, it inherited a strange contradiction. A country where sodomy had never technically been a crime, but where public expression of any sexuality outside marriage was socially unthinkable. Keep that contradiction in mind, because it resurfaces again and again over the next 100 years. Ataturk's reforms hit like an earthquake. In 1926, the new Turkish Civil Code, borrowed almost wholesale from Switzerland, abolished polygamy outright and gave women the legal right to divorce and to inherit property on equal terms with men. In 1930, women won the right to vote in local elections, and by 1934, they could vote and run for national parliament years before women in France or Italy. On paper, Turkey looked like it was racing toward gender equality faster than most of Europe. But here's the twist that most documentaries skip. These reforms were handed down from above by a small secular elite onto a population that was overwhelmingly rural, religious, and largely unconsulted. The law changed overnight. The culture did not. And that gap between legal modernity and social conservatism would define Turkish sexuality for the next century, resurfacing every time a government tried to legislate intimacy from the top down. Through the 1930s and 40s, the state pushed a very specific image of the ideal Turkish woman, educated, unveiled, present in public life, but still fundamentally chaste and family-oriented. Sexuality itself was rarely discussed in public. Sex education was non-existent and remains almost entirely absent from Turkish public school curricula even today. Premarital virginity, especially for women, remained a near-sacred expectation, enforced not just by families but often by state institutions, including, disturbingly, mandatory virginity tests that continued in various forms for decades, sometimes ordered by schools, hospitals, or even courts, as a condition for things as unrelated as employment or custody. Meanwhile, the secular elite in cities like Istanbul and Ankara lived by very different unwritten rules than families in the Anatolian countryside, a class divide in intimate life that has never fully closed, and that divide would only widen once Turkey opened its doors to the wider world. There's another layer to this early period worth understanding, because it explains so much of what came later. The Republic's reforms were not just about law, they were about image. Ataturk wanted Turkey to be seen by Europe as a modern nation, and women's visible emancipation, unveiling, education, professional careers became a kind of national advertisement. But visibility is not the same as autonomy. Women were encouraged to enter public life, yet the state simultaneously reinforced the idea that a woman's primary value remained tied to marriage, motherhood, and sexual restraint. A female doctor or teacher in 1935 Istanbul might be celebrated as proof of Turkish modernity, while a woman who simply chose not to marry, or who pursued relationships outside wedlock, could still face devastating social consequences. Modernity, in other words, was permitted, even encouraged, as long as it stayed within boundaries the state itself controlled. That tension between state-sponsored liberation and state-enforced restraint would echo through every subsequent decade. So what happened when Turkey opened its doors to the West after World War II? That's where things get complicated. The 1950s and 60s brought multi-party democracy, American cultural influence, and a wave of urbanization that pulled millions of young Turks out of villages and into cities like Istanbul, where anonymity made new kinds of freedom possible. Cinema exploded. The Turkish film industry, nicknamed Yeşilçam, became one of the largest in the world by volume, and its films increasingly flirted with romance, seduction, and by the 1970s, outright eroticism. A genre of soft-core films emerged, tolerated by censors as long as they stopped just short of explicit content. It was a strange national compromise. The state would look the other way on cinematic titillation, while still prosecuting obscenity in print and refusing to discuss sex education in schools. Hypocrisy or pragmatism? Depends who you ask. But underground, something else was stirring, something the state was far less willing to tolerate, and it involved a community that had almost no legal protection at all. Because while heterosexual desire found a cautious outlet on screen, queer life in Turkey during this era existed almost entirely in the shadows. Istanbul had an underground trans and gay scene concentrated in neighborhoods like Beyoğlu, but it operated under constant threat of police harassment, and transgender individuals in particular faced brutal treatment, including a notorious period in the 1980s when trans women were rounded up, beaten, and had their hair forcibly shaved by police under municipal public morality ordinances. The 1980 military coup made things dramatically worse. General Kenan Evren's junta cracked down on all forms of nonconformity, and openly queer public figures, including the famous singer Bülent Ersoy, were banned from performing on state television simply for existing publicly as a trans woman. Her case became a strange national flashpoint, a celebrity everyone knew, discussed, and watched be erased from public broadcasting by government decree. If you think that sounds like ancient history, wait until you hear what happened just a few years later, because Turkey's queer community was about to do something no one expected. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, against a backdrop of martial law and social conservatism, Turkey's LGBTQ+ community began to organize, quietly at first, then with growing visibility. Lambda Istanbul, one of the country's first LGBTQ+ rights organizations, formed in 1993, and Kaos GL followed shortly after in Ankara. This was remarkable because Turkey was doing something almost no other Muslim-majority country was doing, allowing, however grudgingly, an organized queer rights movement to exist in the open, publish newsletters, and eventually take to the streets. By 2003, Istanbul held its first Pride March, small and cautious. It grew every year. By 2013 and 2014, tens of thousands of people, gay and straight, Turkish and foreign, were marching down Istiklal Avenue in what became one of the largest Pride events in the Muslim world. For a moment, it genuinely looked like Turkey might become a regional model for LGBTQ+ visibility, a bridge between a conservative region and a more liberal Europe. It was still, at the time, negotiating to join. That moment did not last, and understanding why requires looking at what else was happening in Turkish politics during those same years. Because at the very same time queer visibility was rising, another transformation was underway: the rise of political Islam. The Justice and Development Party, known as the AKP, came to power in 2002 under Recep Tayyip Erdogan, promising economic stability and a more pious, family-centered vision of Turkish society. In its early years, the AKP actually pursued a wave of legal reform aimed at aligning Turkey with European Union standards, part of its bid for EU membership. The 2004 Penal Code reform, for instance, removed a long-standing legal provision that had reduced sentences for so-called honor killings when the victim was found to have behaved immorally, a change women's rights groups had fought for over a decade. For a brief window, EU accession hopes and domestic reform pulled Turkish law in a more liberal direction on questions of gender and family. But that window closed. For years, the AKP balanced pragmatic modernization with conservative social messaging, and initially, pride marches were tolerated. But starting around 2015, the tolerance evaporated almost overnight. That year, police used tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the Istanbul Pride March for the first time. Every year since then, Pride has officially been banned, and every year, activists have marched anyway, and every year, arrests have followed. What changed? Several things at once. A failed coup attempt in 2016 that triggered a broader authoritarian crackdown across Turkish civil society, a deepening alliance between the AKP and nationalist and religious constituencies, a stalling of EU accession talks that removed much of the external pressure for liberal reform, and a global culture war narrative that framed LGBTQ+ rights as a Western import threatening Turkish and Islamic values. Sexuality, once a private matter the state mostly ignored, became a central battlefield of Turkish identity politics. There's one more reform from this window worth pausing on, because it rarely makes it into popular retellings of Turkish history: the 2001 overhaul of the Civil Code, which finally abolished the legal designation of the husband as head of the household and granted spouses equal rights over property acquired during marriage. Before that reform, a woman who spent decades raising children and managing a household while her husband worked could walk away from a divorce with almost nothing, because the law simply didn't recognize her domestic labor as a contribution to shared wealth. Women's organizations had campaigned for this change for years, and it passed only after sustained public pressure, a reminder that most of the gains in Turkish family law over the past century arrived not as gifts from above, but as concessions won through organizing from below. Tourism added yet another layer to this evolving picture. as coastal cities like Antalya, Bodrum, and Marmaris became major destinations for European sunbathers throughout the 1980s, 90s, and 2000s. They created bubble economies where Western dress, casual dating, and public displays of affection were tolerated in ways unthinkable just a few hours inland. Turkish sexuality, it turns out, has never been just one national story. It's dozens of local stories stitched together by geography, class, and how close you happen to live to a beach resort or a European consulate. Meanwhile, heterosexual relationships and family life were transforming just as dramatically, if less visibly, to outsiders. Divorce rates in Turkey, which had been remarkably low for decades, climbed steadily from the 1990s onward as urbanization, women's education, and economic independence reshaped marriage expectations. Cohabitation before marriage, once almost unthinkable outside a small secular elite, became increasingly common among younger, educated urban couples, even though it remained taboo and sometimes socially costly for many others. Dating itself changed too. Turkey embraced smartphone culture as fast as anywhere in Europe, and dating apps quietly exploded in popularity in cities like Istanbul and Izmir throughout the 2010s, creating a strange double life for millions of young Turks who presented one version of themselves to their families and another to a phone screen. Premarital sex, still officially frowned upon, became statistically far more common than public discourse ever acknowledged, an open secret nobody in power wanted to discuss on the record. Meanwhile, internet censorship expanded steadily throughout the 2010s, with regulators periodically restricting access to dating platforms and adult content sites, framed publicly as protecting families and children, but functioning in practice as one more front in the broader campaign to control public discourse around sex. But here's where it gets genuinely explosive, because in 2021, the government made a decision that would ignite years of protest. In March 2021, Erdogan withdrew Turkey from the Istanbul Convention, an international treaty. Turkey had actually been the first country to sign back in 2011, designed to prevent violence against women. The stated justification stunned observers. Officials claimed the treaty's protections for people, regardless of sexual orientation, were being used to normalize homosexuality and undermine the traditional family. Overnight, a treaty about protecting women from domestic violence was recast as a queer rights Trojan horse. Tens of thousands of women protested in the streets of Istanbul, arguing the withdrawal left them more vulnerable to abuse, not less, in a country where femicide rates were already a source of national alarm. It was a preview of a much larger pattern that would define the next 5 years. The government increasingly treating LGBTQ+ visibility and women's rights as two fronts of the same ideological war, rather than as separate issues. That pattern accelerated dramatically after 2023. Following his re-election, Erdogan declared 2025 the Year of the Family, an initiative ostensibly about Turkey's falling birth rate, but which quickly took on a much sharper edge. In speeches, Erdogan described LGBTQ+ activism using language like scourge and deviance, framing it explicitly as a foreign plot designed to weaken the Turkish nation from within, language that echoed a broader global backlash against LGBTQ+ rights, taking hold in several countries at once. This wasn't just rhetoric. Throughout 2025, Turkish authorities dramatically escalated censorship of anything related to LGBTQ+ life. Queer film festivals were banned outright, including one of the country's longest-running events, Peme Hayat Queerfest. Books were pulled from shelves. Digital platforms faced access blocks, and journalists and activists covering these stories faced legal jeopardy simply for reporting. Yildiz Tar, a prominent editor at Chaos GL, one of the country's oldest LGBTQ+ organizations, was arrested on terrorism charges in early 2025, a move human rights groups condemned as a blatant attempt to silence advocacy through the criminal justice system. Trans rights bore the sharpest edge of this crackdown. Turkey had, on paper, allowed legal gender recognition since a 1988 amendment to the Civil Code, one of the earliest such provisions in the Muslim world, requiring individuals to undergo medical evaluation, often including surgical requirements, before a court would approve a legal change of sex. For decades, this process was slow, expensive, and humiliating, but it existed, and thousands of trans Turks used it. The proposals emerging in 2025 threatened to roll even that back, raising age thresholds and tightening medical gatekeeping. To a degree, advocates warned would make legal transition effectively impossible for an entire generation. For a community that had already endured decades of police violence, workplace discrimination, and social exclusion, the message was unmistakable. The narrow legal door that had existed since the 1980s was being pushed shut in real time. And this time, the closing was happening not through quiet bureaucratic neglect, but through deliberate headline-grabbing legislation. And then, in late 2025, came the development that alarmed observers most of all. A draft legislative package, part of what was called the 11th Judicial Reform Package, leaked to activists and journalists in October 2025, and it proposed something Turkey had never formally done before: explicit criminal penalties for LGBTQ plus people. The draft included prison sentences for behavior deemed contrary to biological sex and general morality, penalties of up to several years for same-sex commitment ceremonies, and a rollback of transgender healthcare rights, including raising the minimum age for gender-affirming care. Human rights organizations called it one of the most alarming rollbacks in the region in decades, a legal shift that would take Turkey from ambiguous tolerance to outright criminalization for the first time in its Republican history. As of the most recent reporting available, the proposal had not been formally enacted. But its mere existence signaled a decisive break from the uneasy accommodation Turkey had extended, however imperfectly, to queer life for the previous 2 decades. The country that once hosted the largest pride march in the Muslim world was now drafting laws to criminalize the same community it once tacitly allowed to organize in the open. So where does that leave ordinary Turks navigating sexuality and relationships in their daily lives right now, in 2026? The honest answer is, it depends entirely on where you live and who you are. It also depends heavily on economics, a factor easy to overlook in a story about culture and law. Turkey's currency crises and inflation spikes throughout the 2020s pushed young adults to delay marriage, delay leaving their parents' homes, and delay having children, all of which reshaped intimate life in ways no piece of legislation ever could. A generation priced out of independent housing often finds itself navigating relationships under a parent's roof, a practical constraint that quietly enforces the same premarital caution the state has spent a century trying to legislate directly. Meanwhile, social media platforms became both a lifeline and a liability. A lifeline because they let isolated queer teenagers in conservative towns find community online that didn't exist locally. And a liability because those same platforms became a primary target of the government's 2025 censorship push, monitored, throttled, and in some cases blocked outright whenever officials decided their content crossed an increasingly vague and shifting moral line. In Istanbul and Izmir, an underground but resilient queer scene persists, quieter and more cautious than it was a decade ago, but not extinguished, operating through private networks, word of mouth, and platforms that shift faster than regulators can block them. Surveys of younger Turks, particularly university students, show meaningfully higher tolerance for homosexuality than older generations, roughly a third of young people expressing acceptance compared to far lower numbers among their parents and grandparents, suggesting a generational fault line that state policy has not managed to erase, no matter how much rhetoric or legislation is thrown at it. In conservative and rural regions, especially in the East, LGBTQ plus visibility remains essentially non-existent, and traditional expectations around virginity, arranged introductions, and family-controlled courtship persist much as they did decades ago. Turkey in 2026 is not one sexual culture. It is at least 2, maybe 3, layered on top of each other, sometimes within the same city block. A secular, globally connected youth culture browsing dating apps in a coffee shop, a conservative religious majority anchored in family and tradition, and a state caught between courting Western institutions and consolidating power through culture war politics aimed squarely at sexual minorities, and, increasingly, at women's autonomy more broadly. A century after Ataturk tore up Ottoman religious law and declared women equal citizens, Turkey's relationship with sexuality remains exactly what it was in 1923. A negotiation, unfinished, contested, and deeply personal, playing out not just in parliament, but in bedrooms, dating apps, family dinners, and courtrooms across the country. Every generation has inherited the same unresolved question its grandparents faced, just with new technology, new laws, and a new set of headlines. Whether the next chapter brings further criminalization or a return to the tentative openness of the early 2000s may be the single most consequential question for millions of ordinary Turks navigating love, identity, and intimacy in a country still deciding, 100 years on, exactly how modern it wants to be and exactly who gets to be included in that modernity.